Thank you for those of you that are joining the webinar now. Your sound is working fine. We're just sort of waiting about 2 minutes for people to come in, and then we'll make a start around about 2 minutes past. Thank you. Right, I think we'll get going and make a start. So, as I say, thank you for joining us today for this webinar, exploring the idea of placemaking. I'm just going to quickly run through the Zoom controls for you just before I hand over to our hosts for this webinar. Today we'll be using the Q&A function and the raise your hand function. There is quite a lot beyond the call, so we don't have the chat active, just so it's not popping up and distracting our speakers today. But if you do have any questions at any point, you can just put them in the Q&A box, and there is the option to raise your hand when we're at the sort of Q&A section, and you can just speak your question if you're confident. So if you use the raise your hand function, I will bring you in to speak, and you can talk your question directly to the panel. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen, and you can see our lovely panel today. And I'll just pass you over to Cara, who's just going to give a quick introduction about why we're here and sort of about the book.
Thank you, Tom, and it's lovely to see so many with us here today. Thank you very much. As Tom says, this whole session comes off the back of the Routledge Handbook of Placemaking, which I'm one of the editors, as is Louise, Platt and Tom Burrett, who's in the room with us today as well. And the book really comes from a time when we're looking back over the last 10 years of placemaking, and looking forward to our next 10 years, our next decade, our next era of placemaking, and looking at both of those purviews from a constructive but a critical point of view as well. And that's where Lou, as section editor for the section Problematising Placemaking, that's where that section really comes into its own, and we've got some of the contributors to that section with us here today. We took a curatorial approach to the book as well, so there's obviously Problematising Placemaking comes all the way through it too, and you can enter in through the book depending on what your own subject interest is as well. I should just say too, this is being recorded, and the film of this will go on to the Placemaking Handbook YouTube channel. So just Google for that and it will come up. I'm going to stop talking now. Thank you all very much for being here, and I'm going to hand over to Lou.
Thank you, Cara. So I'm Louise Platt, and I'm a senior lecturer at MMU. And as Cara mentioned, I edited one of the sections of the handbook, and it was a real honour to do that and to kind of curate a series of of chapters in relation to the idea of problematising placemaking. And the kind of motivation for this webinar sort of grew out of some of those issues in that section, but I've actually drawn 3 different speakers from across the book itself, because what we wanted to explore was kind of this idea of where kind of placemaking happens and who's involved in placemaking and who isn't involved in placemaking. And the 3 speakers today, I think their chapters really talk to that that issue and really kind of unpicking what it is, this thing that we call placemaking. So what's going to happen in terms of the format today is that I've asked each speaker to speak about their work in relation to the question of kind of where placemaking happens, and then we will have a bit of a roundtable discussion, and then we will move into a Q&A section. So I'm going to kind of introduce the speakers really briefly, and then I'm going to hand over to them to offer their sort of 5-minute reflections on where placemaking happens. So first of all, we have Morag Rose. She's an artist, activist, and an academic. She worked in the voluntary sector, and she completed her PhD, Women Walking Manchester, Desire Lines Through the Original Modern City, at the University of Sheffield. Morag set up the collective, the Loiterers Resistance Movement. And she is a lecturer in human geography at the University of Liverpool. Next, we have Gail Skelly. Gail Skelly is a PhD candidate at Manchester Metropolitan University, and her research on light festivals is inspired by 20 years of practice in the Manchester arts sector. She was a creative director of Ordsall Community Arts in Salford for 14 years, and I'm sure she'll talk a little bit more about that in her discussion. Finally, we have Tom Borup, who Cara mentioned, also edited one of the sections, as well as having a chapter in a different section of the book. He's been busy. He's an international consultant, speaker and lecturer, addressing cultural planning and creative placemaking, and the founder of Creative Community Builders. So without further ado, I think I'm going to hand over to Morag, first of all. Thank you, Morag.
Hi, thank you, Lou, and thank you everybody for inviting me today. So I'm going to start by talking about what I think the first and one of the main problems with municipal or top-down placemaking is, and that's that it far too often ignores people in a place, you know. So where does placemaking happen? Is it on the ground, or is it through a bureaucracy? I'm using a case study approach of my own experiences to discuss a little bit about how bureaucracy and poor consultation can limit access to decision-making processes, and also to think about the problems, the balances between citizens' kind of passion and emotion and attachment to place, and how that can be brought into a process that very seldom sees beyond commercial value, or certainly within this place. So if Tom could show my slides, please. So the case study is Library Walk in Manchester, and that's a place that thousands of people loved and demonstrated that love in quite practical ways. But in the official kind of council-led narrative, the place was an accident, or in some ways a place that didn't even really exist. So I'm going to counter that. Actually, yes, Library Walk is the space between buildings, but in that space grows imagination and love and alternative visions of the city. So Library Walk came into being in the 1930s when E. Vincent Harris, the award-winning architect, built the circular central library and a town hall extension. So it's the civic heart of Manchester, which is a city in northwest England. And you can see an image of the passageway of Library Walk there. Now, that has always been my favorite place in Manchester. I've been here around 20-something years now. And it's just beautiful. It's curvy and enchanting. And somehow the glimpse of sky is a bit of respite from the busyness of the centre of the city. And I maybe thought, perhaps, you know, my love of this Ginnel, of this space is unique. But actually, I realised that I wasn't alone. It was a place that many people also loved. And I learned this when in 2012, Manchester City Council unveiled plans to block off Library Walk to build the building you can see in the top right-hand corner there. Spoiler, we lost. However, I still think it's worth sharing this story, to build that, and also to put some gates at the other end of the walkway, because a cul-de-sac was created by building that carbuncle, which I may call it. Now, in between this beautiful vision on the left and that building on the right came an awful lot of people who used a lot of different tactics to try and affect change. So you can see the images in the middle are some of the Friends of Library Walk. And I should say, although this is my story and I'm telling it, it's actually a really collective fight, and absolute heartfelt thanks to everybody that took part in the campaign. And I know that some of the Friends of Library Walk are here, and, you know, lifelong friendships and really important strategic lessons were learnt by this fight, which is why I think it's still worth sharing, even though in a very real sense we failed, you know. So what happened? Well, as I said, we used a variety of different tactics to show what this place meant, how it was made, brought into being as something important by people. We lost a planning committee meeting, but then we went to a public inquiry, which was about the actual stopping up of the passageway. I won't go into great deals, but I can answer any technical questions if anybody wants later. The fact that it came down to an issue of a right of way, on a very personal level, my own work has tended to concentrate on the value of public space and of kind of everyday encounters in the city, and on kind of serendipity and beauty and effect, and, you know, psychogeographies, for want of a better word. So actually, this accidentally played to my strengths, and it gave an opportunity to show how important imagination is to people. But there were actually a lot of arguments to keep Library Walk open and to not build on. So just briefly, the first was around civic heritage and pride and the story of the city, you know, the library, town hall, these are things that mattered to a lot of people. The second was around the quality of the built environments. Of many people, including lots of experts, talked about what a cherished space this was, how it had a very special atmosphere. Interestingly, that countered the council narrative that it was an unloved and dangerous space. They couldn't actually show any evidence apart from paid council officials. So there was a very huge power imbalance in the arguments here. And the fact that it took us 8 days to make our case was quite important. There were arguments that the building wasn't even needed. It was joining a refurbished town hall to the library, but there's also a passageway underneath. Any of you familiar with Manchester will know that it does rain here. So saying that people coming into the city might get wet if they had a 30-second walk was quite unusual, especially as there's an underground tunnel. The claim that the town hall entrance or the library entrance was hard to spot was also counteracted. You can see a picture at the bottom there of an archive, the grand portico entrance to the library. It also became absurd. You know, there was something here about the comedy of bureaucracy and the powerlessness of community voices. There were lots of issues around process, around technology, around failed consultations and building standards and such like. Again, that kind of impenetrable bureaucracy that I won't bore you with now. Also, fundamentally, issues of access to space, not just the de facto loss of a right of way that people really objected to, but also from terms of disabled people's access. The building proposed had quite strong opponents from people with sensory impairments and neurodiverse conditions. So really, this case study, what does it show? Well, it shows a profound disconnect about where placemaking happens, whether it happens in that coroner's court where we stood up and made a case, or whether it happens on the ground where people create the places they love, almost in between and in spite of what's going on around them. And I counter that actually is much more valuable. But in a very real sense, you know, we lost that space, although it's still there. Profoundly, it's changed because of the impositions. However, the stories are still there and they're a space on their own. And we still hope that although we can never get the right of way back, we know we only use that space now on sufferance during set hours. We do feel like actually new connections between people were made, a new confidence was gained, a sort of understanding actually that we could engage with systems. And I know lessons were learned from other that were passed on to other community groups, other fights. And also, importantly, friendships were made and solidarities were gained, and an idea that we have this shared imaginary Manchester that is massively powerful and more beautiful and will be resistant and will be celebrated no matter what is imposed upon us. And I think more than anything, it demonstrated that place can be made in the space between buildings, in the spaces overlooked by bureaucracy, if it's where people feel they can make a home and they can feel an attachment.
Thank you, Morag. I'm now going to hand over to Gail Skelly. You're muted, Gail.
Thanks, Louise, and thanks to Cara and also Tom as well for making this opportunity possible today. I certainly share with Morag, sorry, a love of place, and that was part of the inspiration really for this study. And so I'm going to talk about my chapter, which is Rooting Out Place Identity, which was written with Tim Edensaw. and as Lou said, was based on part of my PhD study of a community-like festival in Odsal, where I worked for 14, 15 years, and I'm still involved now as a volunteer. Tom, can I have the first image, please? Thank you. So just to briefly introduce the festival site. So these images show part of the Odsal estate where the festival is. And it's a place which has undergone huge changes in the last 60 years. The closure of its main employer, Salford Docks, which is actually in the background. It's Media City now, the Docklands, but all those lights, that's Media City. It's right on top of the estate, right next to each other. It had all its tightly packed terrace streets demolished, and most recently, huge swathes of the area have been redeveloped, and the population has consequently doubled in a decade. So these changes placed and continue to place huge pressures on the residents who live there, I argue, and that the festival provides them with an opportunity to express their own version of place from the bottom up. So community-like festivals often employ a mythicized version of place, really, and often they have some kind of kernel of misrule. And in this case, it was the myth that Guy Fawkes stayed at Odsal Hall, which is in this image on the right-hand side, a Tudor mansion. And the myth is that he stayed there while plotting one of the UK's most notorious incidents of rebellion. And that myth is understandably locally legendary and inspired this festival. And next slide, please, Tom. Thank you. So the creative practices which sit behind the festival are lantern making, and lantern making is incredibly accessible and you can learn it very easily. It's a vernacular practice based on a few simple skills, and you can see here a resident who's working with willow and masking tape to make a basic structure, which is later papered and lit and then carried at head height on a parade. But making the material structures isn't the focus of the chapter. What is really how the residents have had to learn to run and resource the festival themselves, and when they suddenly lost their previously subsidized management and creative festival team who produced the festival due to austerity funding cuts. So next slide, please. The last slide, please, Tom, thanks. So here you can see part of the festival parade, and there are three aspects of the chapter that I really wanted to point out in relation to how producing and creating the festival, the residents are placemaking from the bottom up. So firstly, they invent a theme every year, and the theme that I talk about in the chapter is of the unsung buildings that they use every day that aren't celebrated in the way that locally and publicly resourced cultural flagship buildings like Odsal Hall, which is fantastic, like the Lowry, which is fantastic. Both are fantastic places, but which aren't used in the everyday by local people. So they kind of wanted to demonstrate that they celebrate their buildings in a very public way. The second mode is that they negotiate the parade route themselves, and in the chapter I describe the walking activity of high spirits, of bumping into neighbours, of conversations about place. The mood was very high, and they begin to sing out greetings and street names in a very high-spirited performance of place as they decide the best route for them through their estate, which best reflects kind of symbolic sense of place for them. And then finally, I talk about how they reclaim the streets, really, and the illuminated forms that they make express the importance of place that have actually endured despite all the demolitions and swathes of regeneration and redevelopment. And it actually symbolises a resilience of place, which older residents often talk about. And it also provides an imagined future of place, really. And it's because it's inclusive of those who live there now. And just to kind of come back to the posed of the middle, in considering the question of where they are in the middle, I first had trouble deciphering where the middle was in relation to this festival. But what I've realised is that in this case study, it's sometimes occupied and it's sometimes not, because in their daytime activities, when they produce and create the festival, they are near in the middle because they have to kind of develop a cultural capital, which they didn't have before. because they need to develop and fund the festival. But at the night time, when they experience the festival, when they're out on the streets, they're much further away from the middle, because they're very publicly expressing feelings of alternative and imagined places, a defiant version of place, really, as a response to living there and in having to deal with all the challenges that they face.
Thank you, Gail. Thank you very much. And finally, I'm going to hand over to Tom.
Good morning. I'm speaking from unceded land of the indigenous Dakota and Ojibwe, people who were forced from these lands and murdered by settlers and their government within the last century and a half. It's an occupation that continues in what's now called Minneapolis. It's an honor to be with you in such great company here today, and it's been a pleasure to work with Kara and to be part of this amazing group of editors and writers. What interests me most in placemaking, I think, like the other two speakers, are the human and social dimensions. And not to open the can of worms, but I've long felt that placemaking is misnamed. It's more about people, community, and the social fabric. Fashioning places is the easy part. It's the people who are complicated. And as a result, conflict sometimes results. And conflicts can be large or small, brief, protracted, violent, or subtle. The practices of placemaking, which is the section that I edited, is thus about the social practices, the conflicts. And I don't mean to dwell on negative parts, but I think it's important to understand how conflict is part of the process, like death is part of life. I'm going to show you a few pictures I took this last summer. And this is a scene from our apartment at 4 o'clock in the morning, 4 days after the murder of George Floyd by a Minneapolis policeman, just a few blocks from here. And this is just a fraction of the areas impacted and burned. Placemaking happens in fits and starts. Work here in this place that involved decades of building a multi-ethnic community was unmade within hours. Or was it? By noon the next day, the same day, by noon, hundreds of people showed up here and other areas surrounding to clean up debris, to show their support for the community. I'd love to give you an extended photo tour of the street level activity, but maybe another time. 2 days later, I took this picture. A group calling themselves The Real Minneapolis placed flowers and other symbols of life among the burnt out buildings. Artists were incredibly prolific as first responders during this period, showing anger over police brutality and showing support for the community. Most moving and meaningful for me were the hundreds of people who sprang into action to distribute food and other necessities at many sites across the neighborhood. Rebuilding this physical infrastructure will take years. The social fabric may be stronger than ever. I believe that's what's most important. And it requires ongoing work. Communities face and will face all kinds of challenges. And it's about how people care for each other and for the place that they call home. And it's their individual and collective actions that really matter. This is, or should be, I think, the work of placemakers. One of the writers in my section, Jonathan J. Ann Chrisman, described disastrous forces, accidental actions, and grassroots responses. I loved his phrase and asked him if I could use it as the title of my introductory essay. His chapter traces a 100-year story of Japantown in Los Angeles. Another writer in the section that I assembled, Jeonggu Shin chronicled 4 decades of rebuilding on conflicted ground in the city of Gwangju, South Korea. Places that saw the death of hundreds, mostly students, who fought and succeeded at bringing democracy to that country just 4 decades ago. He describes how that movement's ideals around human rights and culture reshaped the city. Another story is set in Palm Springs, California, where architectural preservationists, mostly white gay men, came into conflict with Native American tribes that operate resorts and other enterprises. Another story played out in what is known as a moon village in Seoul, South Korea, where government-sponsored artists painted murals creating a tourist attraction. Local residents became frustrated with over-tourism and the visitors' disrespectful behaviors, and they defaced some of the murals. Other conflicts are described in a neighborhood in Lawrence, Kansas, and others in small towns across rural America, where one artist traveled to explore the urban and rural divides causing so much distress in this country. Finally, a story in Newcastle, the UK, where school children got involved in place shaping using unconventional tools. In all of these stories, and I'm really pleased, I hope you'll read the section in the book that I was able to assemble. In all of these stories, people work together to bring about new approaches, new relationships, and new ways of living and working together in the wake of challenges and shaped often by conflicts. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. So we're going to have a little bit of a discussion around some key themes that have emerged before we turn over to some questions from the audience. And I was furiously writing down kind of keywords and things that came out of those 3 little vignettes, if you like. That's a nice word, isn't it? We'll call them vignettes. But one of the things, and obviously when I've read through the work of the presenters here in the book, one of the things that kind of jumped out to me was a theme around collaboration and different forms of collaboration, and the way collaboration cut across different scales, I guess, in terms of collaboration on a level, collaboration that went kind of up and down, bureaucratic collaboration, failed collaboration, community collaboration. So I wanted to kind of ask the panel to talk a little bit about the role that collaboration plays in placemaking. I don't know if we want to take turns, maybe start with Morag.
Hi, yeah. Well, as I think I hopefully made clear, the Friends of Library Walk was inherently collaborative. It wasn't an organization with a structure. It was very task and finish. And actually, because the campaign lasted about 4 years, people drifted in and out through no fallings out. I mean, there was a remarkable amount of coherence, I think, because we had such a very clear aim. So that was quite useful. For me, what was interesting about the collaboration was actually lots of different people brought different skills to it, and it evolved quite, I don't like the word natural, it's not right, but it actually did. I think there was a lot of serendipity involved in the point of, for example, I literally bumped into the 2 experts on rights of way and legal issues who have now become very good friends, and they're absolute legends in the kind of fights for rights of way in this area. But had I not bumped into them whilst on a walk, maybe that wouldn't have happened. So there was an element of serendipity, but lots of people brought different skills. I think 2 points about it really. One was some people who felt they couldn't collaborate publicly because they had roles largely as architects or planners, or people that felt like they relied on Manchester City Council for work. Now, whether they were right or wrong to feel that, I honestly don't know, but that felt quite important. And in terms of scale, this was a very local campaign, but actually we did reach out through social media, through our own connections. A lot of people contributed by writing letters or signing things or having voices who were much further away, who had an interest in the architectural heritage, or who were in other ways felt some kind of ownership of this place. Or I think also it was a little bit of a conduit for other conflicts around planning. It became a little bit of a test case almost, but collaboration was, it wouldn't have happened without that community collaboration. But obviously there was conflict as well with other areas. And the other thing I would say about it was we didn't really have a lot of the internal group dynamics I've encountered in other ways, in that I think to be able to contribute, sometimes you need to have, for example, citizenship status if you're going to be involved in direct action, or you need kind of to have no caring responsibilities, or to be able-bodied or whatever, because people brought different things. We'd all sort of agreed already that we weren't going to go for a direct action tactic for all kinds of reasons. I think I talk about this in the chapter, and it was going to be a very sort of friendly, very joyful, very celebratory kind of collaboration. And it also was, in terms of many campaigns I've been involved in, the only time random strangers have stopped me in the street and offered money or skills or resources. So it was, we didn't need the money, but it was quite extraordinary. So yeah, thanks. So that was a long answer. I think it's because that collaborative was so important to why it's resonated.
No, thank you. I really like that. And I really like that kind of idea of that collaboration being joyful, and, you know, the kind of, as you said, you know, even though you kind of lost, you won something. There was something that was won in that, in terms of the connections and the stories and the way that place has been shaped in people's minds, I think. And that really speaks to Gail in terms of that joyful celebratory collaboration. So I don't know if you want to kind of speak to that, Gail.
Yeah, thank you. I've been thinking in terms of two types of collaboration, really. There's the formal collaboration, because the festival was started as a collaboration between local authority and local activists and residents to combat kind of unrest that was happening at the time, so early 90s. And that's remained throughout the history of the festival, and it's kind of followed an arc with kind of cultural policy subsidy, and has now dropped off. But those collaborations are still key, really, to supporting the festival, even though the kind of formal partners are much more kind of, you know, in the background. They're still there, so they've been really important. But I suppose, and, you know, coming back to what you're saying about the, you know, the joy of the collaboration, the fantastic stuff is in the informal collaborations between the residents themselves, and how kind of groups of community, you know, groups of kind of community activity and interest come together and work together for that festival. You know, most of the year they'll, you know, they do their own thing, they're working on their own projects or whatever, but then they'll come together and work together for a specific period. Everybody knows that from the middle of September to the early November, we've got to kind of provide some space for lighting of the legend, because a gang of people will be around with a bunch of willow and tape and glue, you know, for a couple of weeks, and we'll all be making lanterns. So those collaborations really bring people together.
Thank you, Gail. And Tom, just thinking about your work professionally as well, in terms of you having to work across different types of groups, so working you know, in terms of kind of the state level versus the community level, and bringing an artist and bringing those people together. And I'm kind of just bringing in one of the questions that Claire Timon has put into the Q&A around this kind of distinction between collaboration and partnership working, and kind of community building. And I don't know if you want to kind of speak to that in terms of your work specifically.
Sure, that's a lot to talk about. I do want to echo what the other two speakers just said, and especially the part about the joy. The images that I showed, the story that I shared, there, you know, that wasn't joyful. However, because people had celebrated together, because they had shared food, because they had, you know, passed each other on the street and had opportunity to be part of festivals and so on, when the time came to respond to a crisis, they were there. So that's so important to make the process joyful. And I think in the more formal sense, talking about the cross-sector, you know, cross-cultural, bringing all kinds of different people and skills. And that's what placemaking, I think, is about. That's the fundamental core, is collaboration and building those bridges between different people and different sectors and professions in communities, people who share space and people who have some responsibility for that space, whether they be there or not. They may be in some government agency or whatever. So in my professional practice, which is mostly planning work, community-based planning and facilitating those processes, making them joyful is really important, and artists are really key to that, to getting people up on their feet or you know, singing or celebrating in whatever way. Really important. And so modeling the kind of cross-sector and modeling the kind of joyful experience of listening and working together in the planning process is so important. Some communities that I approach or approach me, they want expert-driven planning, and it's like the experts are the people in the community. You have to listen to them. They need to be involved, and they need to own the ideas and the plan. If you want some, you know, big name expert from somewhere to come in and tell you what you should do, don't, you know, that's not me. So I build that into my practice in every way possible.
Yeah, and I think you talked about placemaking being about the people, you know, and the social fabric. And I saw you nodding there, Morag, when Tom was talking about that listening. And I don't know if you wanted to come in and say something there.
Yes, I'll keep it brief. I think one of the most frustrating elements of Library Walk, and indeed other planning conflicts or issues, has often been a failure to listen to the community and devaluing of voices that are not deemed to be professional or expert in some way, when actually, of course, we are, you know, experts in where we live. And I think I can only speak about Manchester at this very particular period of time, but something went quite catastrophic. I can't even say the word, it's because I'm trying really hard not to swear. Quite calamitously wrong in the consultation processes in Manchester for a while, and we're still seeing that at the moment. I think, again, in the chapter I mentioned Jeremy Deller's Peterloo Memorial, which is a current conflict, because this was to celebrate the not to celebrate, I beg your pardon, to commemorate the Peterloo massacre, which is a really significant part of the placemaking myth in Manchester, part of our radical history, and a very important part of the kind of struggles towards democracy and working class votes and equality and solidarity. But unfortunately, the artist built a flight of stairs, which obviously kind of reifies exclusion and segregation and such like. And that isolation, that big argument, largely with disabled people's organizations and civil rights groups, could have actually been avoided if the consultation process had been more open and transparent and valued those stories. And it feels like a very horrible echo actually of Library Walk, and I've re-met and reworked again with some of the people that I first met then. So those kinds of solidarities have helped us in this new campaign, which has also brought new people in. But it comes down to me a lot of the time as a failure to listen. And I don't think that means that actually there isn't a space for those other voices, but it's somehow how we meaningfully listen, how we meaningfully value and champion those other voices seems a very urgent issue locally here. And I am fairly confident in saying that is not a unique Manchester experience, although it's the one I can speak to.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting around that kind of meaningful listening that you mentioned. And Gail, thinking about you know, your work and how those kind of community members have taken on that festival, and that kind of connection to place and that verbalization of place and listening to each other within that community. So not just listening to experts or listening to external voices and thinking about consultation in that way, but listening to each other within the community, I think was really important.
I think listening to themselves and actually having their own voices heard, I think it is really crucially important, and that's what the selection of these kind of unsung buildings was all about. It was a direct response to being ignored, you know. So yeah.
And again, similar, Tom, I don't know if you want to talk to that in terms of that listening to each other and listening to selves within that community in that situation. You talk.
Yep, absolutely. And getting people to listen, of course, is a challenge. Listen to each other, you know, like I was saying before, sometimes they want to listen to an expert, and it's like, how do you open it up so that people are willing to listen to one another? And one of the things that we found some success at is basing the work in storytelling. And that's where some of the artists who are really wonderful at storytelling through different forms, it may be theater, it may be visual, that perhaps you call it a quilt behind Gail in her image there. I mean, the multiplicity of stories that are in that quilt. I mean, using the visual as well as the oral kind of ways of storytelling, getting people to listen to stories, share their stories, really important, is, I think, a really important part of the work. And, you know, when in teaching, trying to get the students to listen to one another, not just the teacher. I think it's, again, that's about modeling the behaviors. Like, you all have important things to bring to this conversation, and you need to listen to one another as well as to me as the teacher. So you know, I try to bring that into all dimensions of this kind of work.
Thank you. I'm aware there are questions going into the Q&A, and I do keep checking them to see if we can kind of answer them as we go along, but I will come to those questions. So do not worry if you've typed something in there and you've not heard an answer yet, I will come to them. The last thing I kind of wanted to bring before we do go to that Q&A is around this question of kind of place connectedness. And as everybody was speaking, I was kind of writing down these words that people were saying around imagination, love, community, high-spirited performance of place, imagined futures, and you know, this, how kind of people make sense of the places in which they live in, which they work in, the communities in which they thrive in. And I just don't know if you wanted to talk about this kind of connectivity to place and feelings of belonging and how that kind of feeds into placemaking. Morag?
Yeah, I mean, I think it happens at multiple levels. The one that I'm most interested in, that I spent the longest amount of time being involved in as an artist and an activist, is around walking and how we connect through places, through that kind of multi-sensory engagement with place, and a kind of attentive walking a lot of the time, you know, how we can notice things when we have the kind of luxury of being able to do so. And I've been really interested in that as quite a long way, because I think for me, actually what it comes down to, and this is why Library Walk became such a big battle as well for me, was about the value of everyday public space and everyday kind of landscapes, and how we actually deserve to have quite beautiful, quite interesting and varied landscapes. This does, and obviously the idea of beauty is very subjective, but this is somewhere that a lot of people spoke about. And my wider research, many people who live here feel very attached to Manchester, but also don't find it a particularly attractive city centre. For example, it doesn't have an awful lot of green space compared to some places. But actually, this was one of those places that people did feel a connection to. And so for me, I think that one of the things we really need to concentrate on is keeping that kind of public realm for those kinds of playful interactions, for those serendipitous interactions, for those kind of negotiating differences as well. So we're never going to like everybody in a city centre. There's going to be people that, for whatever reason, we disagree with or that we find disagreeable. And actually, I think learning to rub along on that everyday kind of very banal, mundane basis is one of the jobs of city, and one of the ways that we build solidarities across and within when we use that same space. So I really think we need to keep championing those things. And I noticed one of the questions talks about kind of commercial spaces, and I think that there's a real danger with privatizing public space as well, because what we think of as public is not ours, And Library Walk exemplifies that now. You know, we can still walk down it, and we do, but it is not the same because we're there on sufferance and not by right. And so I think that's why those fights are worth having. Thank you.
Gail, I think it's really particularly important about that connectedness in terms of the history of Ordsall and that community.
Yeah, I was just thinking that because the theme often you know, brings about some kind of recent history, and of course, as I was saying before about sort of the redevelopments, recent history has seen large areas of the estate, outside the estate, but inside the estate as well, rebuilt. And there's the right at the center of what used to be the walk-through center of the estate is now a bounded off site. It's quite a big site which used to hold a shopping centre, a library, the chippy, you know, the bookies, a church, the dentist. You know, there's a lot of public services on this site. It's now just completely wrapped around with hoardings, and you can't walk through it. You can't get past it. You've got to walk quite a way around, and it's not even being used. It's, you know, it's a mothballed site, but it's being prevented from use. So I think when you reflect that through how a festival can kind of revisit place connectedness, you know, a festival which walks through the streets, and even though it can't get through that public space, which I agree with you, Morag, is really, really important to uphold, you can at least literally stamp through, symbolically stamp, well, literally, but symbolically saying, you know, through your stamping through the estate, this is still my place, you know, and I have some control over it. Okay, it might be a temporal, you know, kind of minuscule kind of moment in terms of the whole year, you know, it only takes an hour, but I can still do it, you know, I've still got control over that place, and that's, for me, speaks to how connected people are to it.
Thank you. And Tom, you know, what came out of yours around these kind of moments of crisis, how that kind of enables people to enact that connectedness. So you know, you talked about you know, what's happening in your community, but also, you know, crisis around kind of COVID at the moment in terms of the way people think about places. I don't know if you want to talk about that, what crisis does.
Well, I think one thing about crisis is we all don't expect it, and we we don't want it. But I think given the challenges we face on the planet with climate change and what we're seeing in so many parts of the world, there's going to be more and more of these kinds of crises that people need to figure out how to deal with on a short-term level as well, of course, on looking forward in the long term and trying to avoid them or resolve them in advance. But it gets back to that social fabric, and is it there, and is there the capacity of people to work together on those different levels? And you know, in the US, we're just like having so much difficulty with people working together across difference, which seems to only be increasing here. And as the climate crises continue to grow slowly, but they're continuing, I'm not, I don't want to say I'm pessimistic, but there's a lot of work that has to be done, and it has to start on this very local level of people being able and willing to support one another, and to step up during time of crisis. And I think just to reflect on the physical space and the different dimensions and levels, a lot of planners, city planners, urban designers, they think too much in a silo of the physical. And when, you know, they're not thinking about the connectivity that they're either enabling or making impossible, like in Morag's case, there's just blocking a pass-through space that have meaning, and sometimes they don't see the meaning because they're not listening. They're in the professional silo, and so that's what I think placemaking is about, really crossing those professional silos and getting people to listen and to appreciate the different sensibilities of place and of connectivity, that it's very much social and physical. I mean, you need the public, the good public realm and public spaces to facilitate more connectivity. But you really have to be conscious of what are the social dynamics and the kinds of, like the festivals and other events are so important to bring those spaces to life and build on those social connections.
Great, thank you. I think what we might do actually, because there's quite a lot of questions coming in, I think we should maybe move to some of the questions. And I think what I will do is I will kind of work through some of the ones that have been added to the Q&A. I think some of them we kind of might have addressed a little bit, and some of them are quite specific to individual panelists. So Morag, there's a question from Lynn Jones around the what was the reason behind, I don't know if you can see the question there, what was the reason behind the decision to close? Was it stated or unstated?
Oh, yes. So the reason given was to build that the kind of bubble building that I mentioned that was in one of the images, and that building is designed as a link between the town hall and the library. To go back to that question about listening, it wasn't in any of the public consultations about the development. It kind of appeared later. And the reason it was needed, allegedly, was so that people would neither have to go in a lift and downstairs to go between the two buildings, or go outside and potentially have some fresh air or get wet. It wasn't ever really explained why that link was so vital. But I think the unstated aim, and this is my view, was around the regeneration of the area around St. Peter's Square, there was a desire for a kind of landmark sort of building. And I think actually that's part of those processes of placemaking as a kind of gentrification, as a kind of social cleansing, as an excluding people on grounds of space, and of trying to somehow commodify a space. Not that necessarily it could be used to sell things, but it's somehow making it not available. And I do think that a lot of the issues with what we're talking about placemaking does come down to social cleansing by grounds of money and consumability, really. So yeah, that's the official reason and my underlying theories, I think.
Thank you. Tom, I don't know, can everybody see the questions? Tom Hindmarsh, can the audience see the questions, or is it just me? Or
so the audience will be able to see the questions that have been answered. So as soon as I mark them as answered.
Okay, right, thank you. Tom Borup, and there's a question here for you from Erin around how your practice in terms of forming community collaborations are addressing impacts of white supremacy, historical inequalities, and violence inflicting on Black, Indigenous and people of colour, and then celebrate those communities as well. I think you're on mute, Tom.
Yeah, sorry. Yes, we must do all those things. And sorry, I can see the questions, but I prefer to listen and not be distracted by the text. So, I mean, I think, you know, and it varies from place to place, of course. In the U.S., the issues of white supremacy, and they're of course global, but they're so on the forefront right now, and so importantly so. One of the things that I've been recently thinking and reading and trying to address is the ways in which we, as people in placemaking and urban planning and design, create white spaces. We assume we because you know, that's who I am, and many of the professionals, they're creating spaces, you know, by white people, for white people, about white people, and thinking that, oh, these are universal design standards, or these are, you know, for everybody, or whatever. But so much of the the structural design, the activities that take place, the aesthetic, qualities of place are so much about sort of creating a safe, welcoming space for white people. So talking about these things, beginning to break them down and understand them, I think is a really important part of the work, because so many don't realize that that's what we're actually doing. I've just begun to try to have more open and frank conversations and try to bring more people together around these issues of white supremacy, white spaces, and how to think of a variety of different aesthetic qualities and aesthetic practices, and working with artists from a variety of cultures and aesthetic practices to be part of the work, so that we become more conversant and familiar and comfortable in a variety of different kinds of spaces. It's challenging and long-term, and it requires a lot of thought and continual work.
Yeah, I think this also kind of goes to another question that's been asked by Stephen around how creative placemaking is benefiting low-income communities and communities of colour. And you talk about working across cultural groups to bring them into the conversations. And I think you were nodding along there, Morag. I don't know if you wanted to chip in, or whether, I don't know if Kara's there, if she wants to kind of come in on the question around creative placemaking there, or whoever wants to kind of go for it.
I will just say yes, that needs to happen, and I really would like to hear people's good examples, actually, because I feel like, unfortunately, in my brain now, all I can think of are times when that hasn't happened, probably because I'm focusing on a failure here. But by nature, I am an optimist, so I'm sure there are good practices. But yeah, I think it is super important. And for me, one of the failures of placemaking actually is always if it fails to acknowledge the multiplicities of place, because they're going to feel different for everybody in different ways, depending on history, even temporally, a place at night, or when there's lights on. So I think it needs to bring that in, and it's a failure when all those kinds of potential alternatives and that variety of use and that variety of different bodies feeling welcome in space are denied, because I think and I think probably we should think about placemaking and redevelopment and regeneration as a kind of interactive, as a way of enacting civil rights and equality, because we do forget, and as I think too often it is linked with de facto gentrification and or exclusion in some ways, whether through deliberate design or I think more often through a lack of care and a lack of thoughtfulness and a lack of appreciation for those different views. And I wouldn't want to call that meeting in the middle. I want to call it a much more positive thing, a good practice things.
It's a really interesting question, and there are some flagship placemaking projects, which, I mean, one of the sort of longest standing would be Project Row Houses, which is an incredible placemaking project. But I think also, if you're talking about benefits, it's also a question of success, and how are we measuring success, and what success means for one person may be completely different to success for another. That does come up a lot in the chapters and around how to research placemaking and how to evaluate placemaking. But I think also it's, there are different metric processes out there, and are they fit for purpose? And who is defining the placemaking success on those terms? And we're also, of course, now we're at a time when, going forward, a lot of these placemaking projects would have been lived in now. They're not new. They're going to be of some, duration, some longevity. And so in a live way, we can see, have these actually worked? They're no longer an idea. They're real, they are lived in. Are they working?
And to address Stephen's question, and hi, Stephen, I think he's in Malaysia as far as I know. A lot of the work that Gail and your collaborator have done around vernacular creativity and vernacular creative economy, vernacular economy, I think is really important in terms of the ways in which the placemaking work can integrate economic development in a way that's more equitable, as opposed to being the kind of outside investment that comes in, that gentrifies a place and so on, but really starting with what is the unique qualities, identities, resources, skills, ideas, innovative capacities in a place, and building around those and engaging people who are there, as opposed to ignoring them and trying to attract people from outside to come to a place. That's one of the tactics, at least, I think, to build more equitable, economically and socially and place-based, more equitable kinds of communities. I've really gained a lot from these ideas around vernacular creativity and vernacular economies. And I hope that they prove successful for more people.
Gail, I don't know if you want to kind of come in here in terms of the kind of the community in Ordsall and the kind of levels of deprivation and how that festival kind of worked for that community.
Yeah, I think just sort of relating to what Tom's just said there, I think that the inequalities, and actually Morag was mentioning it as well, what I worry about is the scale of the inequalities when you're talking about the different stakeholders that are involved in placemaking and creative placemaking. And I've seen it happen. I've seen it good quality creative placemaking happen temporarily. But I mean, I'm just aware that residents, the rest of the time, aren't necessarily, as Steve said, they're often quite maligned, and they do build insensitively, and they don't always even speak, never mind collaborate. So yeah, the inequalities of creative placemaking, I think, need to be addressed. And what Tom was saying was that the roots-based, the sort of vernacular practices are a way of creating, it's not economic value or power, but it is power that's actually listened to. And in Salford, politicians are starting to kind of talk about what happens in Ordsall as a sort of beacon of community ground up roots practice, which is kind of good for everyone. So
I think this really kind of comes into Steve's question that he's asked here about that we've seen a lot of private commercial developers being involved in placemaking. I know in my kind of opening to my section, I talk about Bruntwood in Manchester and their development on Oxford Road near the university. In their kind of promotional material, they say this is intelligent placemaking. They kind of refer to it in their kind of corporate speak. But Steve's asking about how can we kind of create meaningful collaborations with these stakeholders rather than just dismissing that as corporate speak, I guess. I don't know if anyone, I'm going to kind of open it to anyone to kind of come in there.
I think that language is absolutely important. In some ways, I'm not sure it matters who actually is in control of the physical space in that way, whether it's municipal or profit making, because actually I think the line, certainly in the UK, the line between those things is increasingly blurred, and it comes back again to that language and that listening. And I'm sure I'm not alone in both being amused and revolted by some of the juxtapositions we see on hoardings in every city. I think the particular development you're talking about, at one point, the hoarding was talking about the kind of luxury student accommodation being there. And as a lecturer, I'm thinking about my students who juggle 3 jobs and caring responsibilities and other issues, and how actually what they want is affordable housing, and that's what we mostly need. And I think that it's easy to hide behind a lot of fancy language, and I think that is, you know, power in itself, and that's a violent act, excluding people by using jargon. And I think that certainly, again, in the UK, planning processes and placemaking processes too often exclude because of the occult language or the bureaucracy, or also, actually, let's be honest, how very boring they are and how very hard it is to find out about things, you know. And I'm in no way anti-planning and anti those things, but, you know, I think we need to have a hard look about how hard it can be for people to engage. And actually, if people don't want to engage, we don't have to be creative. People often just want somewhere that's affordable and decent to live, and maybe they don't have the time or inclination to care, and not everybody's an artist or interested in art. So let's think about, you know, people who don't want to engage or can't for all kinds of reasons. But yeah, those hoardings, just it would be great if there could be some kind of moratorium on planning speak, I think.
Did anyone else want to come in on that kind of point before I get another question?
Well, I wish that were only possible to have a moratorium, but I mean, for me, placemaking, creative placemaking, whatever version of it, has been about grassroots community organizing, bottom up, you know. But of course, as we know, capitalism will adopt and adapt to everything to suit its needs, and so that's what's happened in many cases. I mean, there's been a lot of really good community organizing based placemaking that has gone on in the States, at least, but it's often overshadowed by the outside investor forces coming in and using that. And that's one of the reasons that I think the term itself, placemaking, was so quickly spread around the globe, not as fast as COVID, but almost, because it's about place. It's about the real estate. It's about, you know, physical space that which is important. Obviously, we need it. We share it. It's really critical to our lives. But the real work, I believe, is really the community building and the social fabric, and those terms are just too squishy and soft, and not as popular as placemaking. So, you know, the language is important, and how we address it. I do what I can.
I think Mary's question around is there potential for an international placemaking day where this kind of global impact of placemaking can be explored and united, and she's coming from Johannesburg in South Africa there, and I think, you know, what you said there, Tom, around how placemaking, people have kind of adopted it as a thing, as a brand almost, but actually, you know, essentially it's about what's happening in communities, what people are doing, the social fabric. So there almost is a kind of united sense of placemaking, in the sense that people live in communities and they make sense of the spaces, but has the kind of, where am I going with this? One of the kind of points I make, you know, around problematizing placemaking in the section in the book is, I kind of wonder if the phrase placemaking means anything anymore. Has it become meaningless as a word? Cara raised a hand there.
It's one of the reasons, one of my reasons behind the handbook anyway, was actually to stake that claim now for a better understanding of placemaking. We are in danger of, well, it's happening already, but at that global level, for placemaking to become a thing of place wash, to become completely meaningless. And that I think that's a very dangerous thing. And there is a dominant narrative by those that have the means to the dominant narrative, and they could just take over this completely, and the radical, you know, potential of placemaking is completely lost, and actually the radical practice of what is happening now already is completely lost as well. So I actually think we're at quite a critical time in our understanding of placemaking and what we call it and how we do it, who we do it with and for, and our ethical standpoints in that, because otherwise I think this practice could completely run away from us. Sorry, that was really doom and gloom.
Morag, were you waving then, or yeah?
No, I was clapping. I was thoroughly agreeing with Cara. So thank you, Cara.
Brilliant. There's a couple of questions I'm kind of going to bring together. So quite a few people have asked around how kind of the COVID pandemic has changed the way in which we kind of make place, I guess. And I'm just going to open that to anyone who wants to respond.
Sorry, there's somebody else in the room here, Dr. Anita McCohen, and she will know what I'm about to say. Anita and I have been talking about the experience that we've had of place post, with COVID through and hopefully coming out of COVID, and how much trauma is there, and the syndemic situation we found ourselves in last year is also trauma. And there's a lot of streets or places in the handbook that are mentioned that are places of trauma, and trauma from Black Lives Matter protests through to sort of more historical trauma, and it's in place and it's in us as people. So we're starting a line of inquiry around a trauma-informed placemaking. But yeah, this really, that very specifically came out of seeing people feeling so detached from their place because of COVID and wanting to still be noticed, their artwork in their windows, their performances on their balconies, they still wanted that public presence, and that public-private thing was just literally out the window, bad pun. And then the very obvious trauma of Black Lives Matter protests in the States and around the world. So that's a line of inquiry that we will be pursuing, but yeah, very much coming through a trauma-informed lens on that.
Thank you, Cara. Go on, Morag, sorry.
Oh, no, I was going to say, I think that's really important, and I worry actually that in the move to inverted commas recover, or build back better, whatever that means, that trauma and that loss of individuals who've been loved, of time, and I think also of dreams and spaces of imagination, the plans people had last year, we need to take that time. And I'm not sure, again, from a UK perspective, really, we're very good at admitting that or taking that time, and I think we need to acknowledge it. And I do think the other, the radical changes that have happened that are observable, obviously our relationship to homes. And I spent the first lockdown in somewhere without a garden. I wasn't actually at my home, and tiny violin time, but it really reminded me those things that we know in our bones that we need. And I know I'm not alone in that, needing that sort of public green space that we don't always have, those kinds of design standards, to go back to why planning, placemaking can be valuable. All those kinds of many axes of inequality that we know are already there, that the ruptures have become so enhanced by COVID, and particularly in people who haven't been able to go out and enact in public, people who've been shielding, disabled people who've really felt often always known that places are not built for them many times over. And actually that has become particularly prevalent. There's been a lot of resurgence in discourse around eugenics and who's fit to be seen in public. I think this are other levels of trauma. There is no positive to COVID, but one thing, to be slightly more positive, I think it has certainly connected back with local places. People have been having to, and as somebody whose main practice as an artist is around walking, there's definitely been a revival and an explosion in creative walking, of hyper attention to locality, of kind of creative interventions in very local places. Conversely, I'm probably not the only person who's absolutely entirely fed up with my street at the moment. I want wider horizons, but there's all kinds of changes that we can't even begin to think about in terms of shopping and online and offline. And I do think there's also new solidarities that have been built as well. The revival in mutual aid organizations has been really heartening, those kinds of new connections across cyberspace as well. And I think that there's been a real resistance to think about placemaking on and offline. And I think that we'll have to really spend time to think how that changes stuff as well.
Thanks,
I
Laura.
do
Oh, go on.
15-minute city is really going to be tested in our future years for sure. Yeah, and that hyperlocalism. Yeah,
it is going to be fascinating, but I don't want to ever sound that like I'm seeing good things, because I'm not.
I'm just really conscious of time, and there's a couple of themes I want to bring out from that kind of cuts across some of the questions. So I apologize if I've not directly addressed a question, but there's one here which kind of speaks to what we were just talking about in terms of the idea, you know, a few of you talked about these kind of imagined futures and how people see the future of their places and whether that's imagined or real, and how that's maybe changed at the moment. What is the future for, you know, the places in which we live, and how we're kind of approaching that within our communities. I'm just going to leave it to the floor. I don't know if anyone wants to kind of come in on that. Tom?
Yeah, are we going to compete for it?
Gail and then Tom.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, just very quickly to say that one of the things that comes out in the rest of the study that's not really in this chapter is how the festivals are able to express a specific value to place, or the values that people specifically have to place, which I discovered because I've done another case study as well, so I could compare the two. And I think in this festival, it's around the importance of children having the right to access sort of a community, sort of a place in their community, and the ongoing nature, cyclical nature of, you know, the ongoing nature of community, and their place in that. But what's changed in that theme since COVID is that the values have expanded beyond that local place, and because the residents want to actually commemorate lives lost during the pandemic. So there's this kind of elasticity there that they've expanded their compassion beyond just looking at their small place to the rest of the world. And so, you know, it's connected them to people in other places all around the world.
Tom, did you want to come in on that point?
Yeah, well, first I want to say it's really dangerous to predict the future if you, because it's so difficult. And although one thing that I heard years ago and keep in mind in my professional practice is that it's much easier to get people to agree on what they would like to see happen than it is to get them to agree on what actually did happen. So, so visioning work is a lot of fun because I think it enables more people to come together around a vision for the future, and that's, you know, why I enjoy doing some of that kind of work. But I'll just have to add another thing about the future, which is the young people of today, and you know, I'm no longer one of them. And I want to reflect on just a few months ago, I was at a virtual conference for several days of the creative placemaking group in the States, this art place. And it was their kind of closing down after 10 years of funding and so on. And the conversation and the younger, most people are younger than me now, so the young people who were there were amazing. I mean, they had moved so far in that 10 years where that conversation was into a place of talking about equity, talking about race and class issues and capitalism, and, you know, all these things that, you know, that were not being talked about. I was blown away by the level and quality of the conversation that was coming from, you know, this mostly younger generation. So, you know, in that sense, one can be optimistic, and I think a lot of people have said, you know, that young people now are more activist and stepping up in ways that we haven't seen since the 1960s. Those of us who were around in the 1960s. So anyway, I hope that's a good sign for the future.
I keep saying, well, the young people are going to save us. I feel like I really do. There's a few questions that I'm just trying to kind of tie some of the threads together of a few of the remaining questions. If we can kind of start to round things up, I'm just conscious of the time that now. There's a few questions about kind of getting different groups to listen to each other, and this kind of brings us back to this question of where the middle, is there a middle ground in which placemaking can be negotiated in terms of a middle ground between the kind of the top down and the bottom up? For example, where might that middle ground lie? Does the middle exist? Is it constantly being renegotiated? It's a bit of a big question, but I'm trying to tie all those last questions that are left in there into kind of some sort of summing up and linking it back to the theme of the event. So I don't know if it's worth maybe going to the three panelists and Cara in terms of, you know, where is this middle ground? Is there a middle ground? Is it ever possible to kind of to meet in the middle in terms of placemaking? I don't know if we want to go through each in turn. It's a big question. I can see Morag like furrowing her brow. Do you want me to come to you at last, Morag? Are you happy to?
No, it's fine. I guess I was thinking actually the case study I chose for this chapter is a really bad example of where that can happen, because actually, you know, the middle of Library Walk was that beautiful place where you can't see the end and you have this moment of respite. And because it was an either or and we lost, I think it's very hard to think what the middle ground might have been in that case. But I think if better listening had happened, or even perhaps if there was a better rationale for the work, maybe it could have been. And generally, do I think a middle ground is possible? Yes, I hope so, because I am an optimist, and in a past life I was a community worker, and I've often seen negotiations and consensus and such like, but it's not easy. And I think the bit that is hardest is the people in power, for whatever reason, have to give something, and it's often harder for them to step back a bit. So I'm always optimistic. And to go back to that question about imagination, I do think that's absolutely key. And I think that it takes imagination on all sides and kind of creativity and, if at all possible, to keep that idea of multiple places in one place, if you know what I mean. I'm a big believer in the different layers and the different stories, and everywhere we are, you know, that balance between the metaphysical and the possible and the actual material. So yes, and I really hope somebody else will have the magical formula to make it happen.
Gail, not the magical formula, your thoughts?
Oh yes, I've got a magical formula. No, yeah, I could waffle on about this for a long time, so I will keep it short. And as I said in the presentation, I think it's a movable feast in terms of, in this case study, where the residents are is sometimes they're nearer the middle and sometimes they're nearer the edge, and it depends on where they are in the life of the festival, which wraps around 12 months really. But I mean, you know, festivals are arguably mandated spaces of misrule, aren't there? You know, there's allowable misrule for us to kind of rattle our chains loudly in public, you know, and this is a kind of it pierces our pressure. But I think for the people that I've been working with, it's an opportunity to recognize there is somewhere else from where they are, and that the festival can enable them to move to other places. Whether they get to the middle, whether they want to get to the middle is another question, but it certainly gives them other routes of personal development for them to move. So yeah.
Thank you. Tom, your thoughts?
Well, first of all, just with Manchester Library, Morag, I don't know why just a glass roof to connect the two entrances, you know, that you could still pass through, why that wasn't a middle. But anyway, another way to think about middle, and I've been having discussions this week with some of my students about the top down, bottom up kind of, where's the middle? And you know, we've been talking about Richard Florida, you know, as being this like very much top down thinker, and then other work in the way that, you know, I've talked about placemaking as being very much a bottom up, but meeting in the middle with those strategies. And I think part of the challenge we face is we become locked in one or the other. Some people think, well, this is the solution, has to come from here, and the other people think the solution has to come from here. And really, there's a middle there that I think can be and has in some cases proven to be very productive when, you know, the policy on that larger level and the activism on the community level come together. I mean, it's magic when that happens, not very often. But I think we have to think about being open to both of those approaches are valuable when we can, you know, have that vision, that agreed upon future.
Thank you. Sorry, it just took a while for my button to unmute. Cara, I don't know if you want to speak to this in terms of.
Yeah, I you know, place is complex. You might feel you're in the middle, somebody else might think you're in another place completely. And Morag, you know, it's absolutely right that there are power plays and power positions in place all the time, and one person will, or you know, one group will probably have to give up more than the other, and there's a power imbalance about where that usually ends up lying. And that you know, for me, brings up ethical questions of the placemaker and where do I sit in whatever sort of topology that I'm in at that time. And it makes me think as well about where am I personally, but where also, you know, anybody that I might be working with, where are we prepared to compromise? Where's our line? What's the things that we absolutely cannot give up when meeting in the middle? And it's also, I've seen there a lot of groups just bypass this completely. And create and work in their own paradigm of place, and I think that's really exciting. And if that can point to a future different way of doing things, then I'd love to see that.
Thank you. I really apologise if we've not got to everybody's questions. I know some questions have come up in the last moment, but I think hopefully there is Tom. You have Tom's contact details, so if you desperately wanted a question answered by you know, one of the panel, please just send those questions to Tom and he can pass them on, and we can definitely try and get your questions or thoughts kind of to the panel members. I just want to really say thank you to Cara for kind of bringing this amazing book together. Like I keep saying that when you're working on something, you don't see it. And then suddenly when it kind of came in the post, there was this moment where I just went, oh my God, this is brilliant. And there's just this kind of moment of wonder of this thing that she's created. And I'm just going to read the quote that she's kind of put at the very front of the book, because it kind of made me cry a little bit when I first opened this book, thinking about my own experience of having a baby in lockdown and having to create a community for myself. And it says, first show up. In a while, people will come to know you. Keep showing up, and in a while, you will have a community. And that's from Carol Babel, who's the founder of the Ash Cultural Centre in New Orleans. And I just think that kind of sums up placemaking, and it sums up the creation of this book. So thank you, Cara. I want to thank the panelists for agreeing to be involved today, to bring your insights. I think we could have maybe taken more than an hour and a half to kind of unpick this question of placemaking. And I would like to thank Tom for holding it all together, taking care of the technology, so we didn't have to think about it, and kind of doing all the promotion activity, and just making it easy, essentially. I'm just thinking, I'd like to thank the Institute of Place Management for co-hosting this event with the Business Transformations Research Centre, which is in the Business School at Manchester Metropolitan University. And I'd like to thank all the people who've come and listened. There was, I think, 126 of us at its peak, and the 72 of you who are still here, thank you very much. So thank you, and I hope, I think, Cara, we've talked about maybe trying to do another event linked to the book similar to this. So I'm sure you'll hear from Tom about future events. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Take care.